Hello and welcome. We're going to take a few minutes to let more people come in. Welcome, welcome. Feel free throughout the webinar to go ahead and use the chat. Just double check that you have it on everyone and not host and panelists at the bottom. It should be a blue button and you can select everyone instead of host and panelists. Welcome, welcome to our webinar. Come on in.
Let us know where you're from. I'm curious who's on the call today. I'm sitting in Portland, Oregon, so always fun to check out where our neighbors are coming from. Oak Park, Illinois. All right. San Jose, Austin, Vancouver. Vancouver, Washington. You're just up the street from me. Portland. All right. Oh, wow. Look at all these folks. Raleigh, North Carolina, St. Joseph, Michigan. I'm from Traverse City, is where I was born and raised. And then Milwaukee right across the lake from me. Hi, Miami. I'm a little jealous of your weather right now.
Now, as the webinar happens, feel free to add your questions in, and at the very end of the webinar, we'll answer the questions. So definitely keep using the chat as you've been doing right now. And just as a reminder to people who have just come in, double check that at the bottom where it says the chat, make sure that you've selected everybody or everyone, not just hosts and panelists, so that everybody can see the chat.
Wow. Sarah, thanks for joining us from Germany. It's evening there. Appreciate you making time. Ashley, we're coming to Austin soon. Got a ECLC event coming in Austin very shortly.
All right, so we're going to start off now. I'm going to hand it over to Aric Wood, who's going to lead us through this webinar, and I hope you guys enjoy it and looking forward to seeing all your questions in the chat.
Thanks so much, Julie. Hey, I'm really delighted to see all of you here. I recognize a number of the names in the chat, so glad to see some old friends. And for those of you that are new, let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Aric Wood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Tigerhall. We're a all-in-one change platform meant for change leaders like you. So love to chat with you today about this topic. I'm also the author of the Strategy Activation Playbook, which was really written to be a playbook for change leaders to really break down how to do change activation in a more people-centered way. So a lot of the content we'll be talking about today is going to be rooted in that content. In terms of my background, I used to lead the change design consultancy Explain for 19 years. And prior to that, I was a strategy consultant at Bain and Company. But importantly, I always tell people don't trust a consultant that's never done the work. I also have been in the seat of a senior leader inside a large Fortune 500 organization, most recently at Intuit prior to Explain, leading large transformation type of projects. So I've had a sense of what this takes to do it inside the organization as well. And that's always a very different picture, as I know you all know from the view a lot of consultants have. During the course of my work, I've been the advisor to dozens of Fortune 500 and global government, NGO, and nonprofit organizations, mostly focused on leading change and transformation. So a lot of the content we're going to talk about today is rooted in observations of those organizations that were successful, what worked, what made them different. So that's what we're chatting about today. I do want to highlight that this is the first in a series of 7 webinars that we're going to be building out. It's meant to really work as a family. So today I want to kind of go over the 101 course. What are the fundamentals of change activation? But then we're going to introduce sort of the 4 phases that I outline in the book: envision, discover, design, and execute. And in the coming weeks, we'll do a deep dive in each one of those. So if you're curious about some of the content we have today and you want to come back and explore more, we'll have a deeper dive available for that. And then I want to close the series with 2 webinars on topics that I think are sort of a summary of value. The first one is, how do we build a business case for change? One of the hardest things I think we all have is getting the resources to activate change. How do we actually get the investment to be able to pay for those communications, those learning programs, that capability building work? to make sure that we're successful. So we're going to talk a little bit about best practices around building a business case for change in one of our last webinars. And then we're going to close with best practices for leading change from the C-suite. So what are the observations of how leader-led change can be the most effective, and what are some of the tips and tricks to do that? So I do hope you'll join us for the full series. If you haven't signed up, we'll drop a link towards the end of the session, and love to see you here for more of these conversations. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a couple topics. This is going to be a pretty full-packed hour, so for subsequent webinars, we'll probably have more time for Q&A. Today, we're probably going to use most of the hour because we're trying to introduce the core concepts. We're going to talk first about the principal reasons that strategies and major change programs fail. We're then going to talk about a more human-centered approach to change built on both the activation curve, which is a concept I'll introduce, as well as some of the content from the Strategy Activation Playbook. And then we'll actually focus on those four phases we talked about. So we'll give you a quick overview of each of those four phases, as well as some of the kind of go-to tools and exercises that you can start to use today with your own teams to start to do this work. And then coming up in the subsequent weeks, we're going to unpack all that in a lot more detail. So if this content is of value to you, I hope you come back. So first, before we kick off, I'd love to know who's in the room. So Julie, if we can queue up the poll, just a quick question to see who's in the room. What's your role in leading change? So you're all here interested in the topic. Some of you are probably full-time change makers. Some of you are probably part-time. Some of you are maybe leading change. Some of you are working from the outside. Just love to get a sense of who's here. And then with that, I'll try to tailor some of my comments and case studies to the folks in the room. And then Julia will cue us when we've got a pretty good quorum and share the results back to us. All right, so I'm going to look to my right here. I can see these results. We've got a lot of full-time change practitioners. So a third of you are actually doing this work full-time, which is amazing. Also glad to see that even more so, senior leaders with responsibility for change teams in the room. So this is definitely targeted at you. One of the things I think that is most important to me is persuading senior leaders that change agility is actually one of the most important competitive advantages. Organizations that are led by people that understand the value of change are organizations that are going to adapt more quickly. And obviously in this world, that's pretty important. So glad to have all of you here. And why don't we just dive into some of the content then? I will speak very heavily towards the role of leading change quite often through each of these individual conversations. So on to the topic of what is change activation. So this is something I think that bears the requirement for definition. I made a stab at it in my book, and I said that change activation is the art and science of persuading people to align around, engage with, and adopt new ways of working in order to achieve a shared vision. I want to highlight that people is in the center of this. We need to shift our thinking away from change management being this mechanical approach, and we need to shift towards a more people-centered approach to understand that really change is about persuading people to get on board with the movement. We're making a movement from where we're at today to where we're headed, and we need to get people on board to take that journey with us. So we're going to talk about it from that framing. We want to talk about things like, first and foremost, the big myth. So we all believe, and I think part of the reason that we see change fail so frequently is that for whatever reason, we still have this idea in our heads that we go right from our strategic planning process, right from that 100-page PowerPoint deck that we got from the consultant to execution. And in fact, we know that that doesn't work, right? Various sources have confirmed that between 70 to 80% of change, transformation, and strategy deployments fail. And that's on top of the fact that we've spent maybe $160 billion a year on hiring outside consultants and a multiple of that on the inside of organizations in terms of the resources and time we've invested. So one of the things that really caused us to think about is why is this? Why is this happening? Why is the failure rate so high? Well, I think the reality is that we often move from strategic planning to failed execution because we ignore this big spot in the middle. And this big spot in the middle is thinking about the people. I call this the activation abyss. If we skip this step, we're going to fall into that hole and we're going to fail around people issues. How do we bring people to this conversation and get them on board? Part of this makes some sense. So, from the perspective of somebody who has been a senior leader in an organization, as senior leaders, we're paid to see farther sometimes, right? So, senior leaders often see that next place we're trying to go. They look out and they say, that's the next mountain we want to climb. That's the summit we need to go to. We're going to make a plan to get from here to there. And then I'm going to share that plan with everybody. The problem is that what most people in the organization sees is a picture that looks more like this, right? There be dragons, there's risk, there's fire, there's clouds, there's storms. I probably, as someone in the organization, can't even see that summit because either it's too far away from my day-to-day work or it's obscured by my concerns around the risk and the things that might come between me and there. And I don't even necessarily understand why it is that the CEO wants to go to that place. So we need to start to think about how to address some of the people issues and the change. And one of the things that we've really explored are why does change fail? Why do transformations fail? It's not usually because the strategy is bad. It's not usually because that's not the right summit to climb next. It's usually because, and McKinsey has a fact that said that 70% of those failed transformations drop because of people issues. It's because we haven't done the right job in getting those people persuaded to join the movement and that the movement is the right movement to make. So I'd like to boil this down to sort of three core reasons that you should be thinking about and maybe identifying and interrogating in your own organizations. The first one is the idea of line of sight between people and mission. So one of the places that we fail is that we continue to have these tops down kind of hierarchical one size fits all plans where we're going to roll out our strategy and we're going to tell one story and everybody will receive it and move to action. But that's not how it works. What we realize is that we can't have one story because we've got lots of different organizations or lots of different people in our organization with different points of view, different perspectives. And what we really need to do is connect each individual in the organization to the vision, the roadmap to get there, and their role in it. And if we don't speak to them in terms of why is this vision good for you? What does it mean for you? What are the things that we're going to support you in helping to take this journey with us? And what's your role in it? For those folks, this is going to feel scary. It's going to feel riskful. So we need to start thinking about a more personalized approach to developing that line of sight between people and the mission. Secondly, lack of employee engagement. We, with the tops down approach, are sending one-way communications. And the problem with that is numerous. Number one, the organization has a lot more knowledge around what's going on the ground than we do. Those folks that are being impacted by this probably can make the plan better. They can probably help us in the process of deploying new ways of working. They can probably help us in thinking about what are the right ways to make these changes. And so if we can engage them, even in the strategy session, but if not, even in the, or certainly in the deployments phases, in two-way feedback loops, two-way conversations, we're going to do two things. We're going to make the plan better, number one, because we're going to get the benefit of the organizational insights. And secondly, for those folks that have been engaged in the process, they're going to see their fingerprints on the plan and they're going to feel a sense of ownership, which is going to help them get to a point where they're going to be more supportive and on board with the program. So we want to engage employees to a much greater degree than we do today. And then lastly, and this is the one that probably is my biggest mantra in life, is talking to CEOs and saying, we need to invest in activation. By and large, that $160 million of 160 billion, excuse me, dollars of consulting spend isn't followed by a commensurate investment in activation plans to bring change to life in organizations. We don't tend to invest in the communications, the capability building, the culture activation kind of activities that we need to invest in order to get people to change their way of working. And so if we don't think about backstopping our transformation plans with the right amount of resourcing to actually bring it to life in the organization, we're likely to fall into that activation abyss and be part of that 80% of organizations that are going to fail. So what we want to talk about is a couple things. First, why does this happen? It doesn't happen because organizations are dumb. And then we're going to talk about what we can do differently and how we as change leaders can actually change this math to get us into that 20%. I think very simply and in summary, part of why we're here isn't because we are dumb, we don't understand the world, we're mismanaged. It's none of those things. It really just comes down to the fact that there's been a structural change in the way businesses work. So if you think about the history of change management, a lot of change management was designed in the business schools in the 50s and 60s when we really did live in this upper world, this tops down hierarchical structure where organizations were much more command and control. So a lot of the change management theory was developed in that context, right? But what changed is in the 70s, as we started moving from the industrial into more technology age, and then from technology into creative economy, we started to see from the 70s and 80s and 90s that we needed to hire people with more agency. We needed to hire people that were creative, that were innovative, that were individual thinkers, and that ultimately were being paid for being not a cog in the machine, but rather a creative innovator in an organization, in a more organic organization. So our organization has changed dramatically, but a lot of our ways of working have not at the corporate level. So we need to adapt with that. We need to shift to a more modern approach. And this is something that we need to work as change agents every day at with our peers, many of whom were trained in that old way of working, right? So even if you look at the old school language, it speaks to that tops down approach. We talk about things like change management. We talk about forcing stakeholder buy-in. We drive adoption. We cascade information. We're really focused on gaps and problems and being very process driven. Step one, step two, step three, step four. Those all speak to that idea of the organization as a monolith. And what we want to do is shift to a completely new frame. So, change management in this new way of working, this more people-centered way of working, is more about vision activation and change leadership. How do we get people excited about a future state and help lead that change and those folks to join that journey? How do we go from stakeholder buy-in to more stakeholder engagement, getting people engaged in the process, therefore feeling some ownership of it? How, instead of driving adoption, do we get to more authentic participation? And this is about getting some of that two-way feedback and some of that engagement and creativity from our teams, harnessing some of that stuff that we really value from them. Instead of cascading information, likewise, what are our opportunities to create co-creation opportunities? What if we brought that vision and strategy to our teams and said, hey, here's what we're thinking. How might we make it better? So we've got those ideas in our organization. If we release those ideas, we'll probably end up with a better plan and we'll end up with more support and buy-in for the changes. And then we also want to start thinking about how we build momentum in the organization. So rather than just focusing on gaps and problems, how do we also, as organizations, start focusing on the bright spots and the successes? Because at a people level, telling those success stories and focusing on those bright spots are going to get the detractors at least off the fence and hopefully on board and moving forward with us. And then finally, and really importantly, and it's a theme you'll see in these conversations going forward, is we have to move away from this process-driven approach, which basically says we're going to take the entire organization through phase one, two, three, and four, and recognize that that's not how it works, right? Some people are going to get there faster. Some people are going to get there slower. Some people aren't going to get there at all unless we take some iterative approaches to getting there. So we need to be thinking more from a designing from principles perspective and understand that change is going to be a series of iterative loops where we're going to launch something, we're going to learn what's resonating, what's not, and then we're going to come back and iterate so we can keep everybody moving forward together. So with that, we're going to start to move towards some of the content around the how, but I want to leave us with a sort of a key concept here around how important the people are. I think most of you are probably here because we're aligned that people are important. But this is a very simple example, I think, that you can use within your organization as well to explain why not every transformation effort is the same. Sometimes we say, okay, here's our template for transformation. Let's go do that same play again. And what we need to say to ourselves instead is, what's different about this transformation and how will this impact the people in the organization? So using a seesaw example, I think we can use physics to help explain what I mean by this. If we think about all transformations as basically boiling down to we're in a current state and we want to move to a future state, How do we get there? Well, if we press that lever, we'll go from the current state to the future state. The problem is the amount of pressure we put on that lever is different in every single transformation. And the reasons are A, the transformation's different. It's going to impact people differently. People are going to have different attitudes towards each transformation, and different people will have different attitudes towards each transformation. And B, the entire organization itself is also an organism that is maybe more adaptive. Some organizations are used to change. Part of their culture is that change is a constant, and we're good at this. Others are more entrenched. We're resistant to change as an organization. We're traditional. We're kind of living in the past. And where we are, the people collectively, is going to make a big impact. Specifically, if we're a highly adaptive organization, you can see that fulcrum moving to the left. The amount of pressure you need to put down your transformation campaign is less. But if our organization is highly resistant to change or highly resistant to this particular change, the amount of pressure you need to put down on the right is much more significant. So we need to even be thinking about each transformation effort as being a unique creature that we need to assess and understand before we design our activation program, because the amount of resources we're going to need to invest will vary based on what we find here. So here's the bridge. We're going to start to build the bridge. We're going to start to talk a little bit about how we do this successfully. To move from strategic planning to successful execution, we want to cross that activation abyss by confronting some of those issues that we highlighted earlier, the three issues, and figuring out what's the antidote. How do we actually take those problems out of the equation so that we can increase our chance of success? So the first one, if you remember, line of sight was the concern I had. Antidote one is to create line of sight by using more personalized navigation systems, more personalized learning journeys for each of the stakeholders in our transformation and change. We, as table stakes, have to make sure that when we start telling our stories to employees around this change, that our mission, our purpose, and our values are very much aligned with the vision that we're setting. So this vision is consistent with those things. If the vision isn't consistent with what we tell people we're about, they're already going to reject it. So at the senior level, at the C-suite level, we need to ensure that when we start telling that story of our new vision, that it's very much in alignment with where this organization's meaning is for people. Most organizations are pretty good at that. Most organizations are also pretty good at having a strategy that equates to a plan to get to that vision. So when we start telling that strategy story, we want to make sure that that strategy is the answer to the question, how are we going to get there? And if we get that right, we're now better than most organizations. Where we really need to do the work is in the next two steps. How do we, for every employee in the organization, every person in the organization, how do we then break that down into a roadmap of the journey segments that we have to take to get along that strategy to the vision? Not everybody is going to be part of every segment, right? Some teams are going to work on this part, some teams are going to work on that part. So we want to break it down into bits that are starting to think about what role do you have to play as a team in this transformation? And then go one step deeper, which is to say, and for you, the product manager, the account executive, the engineer, this is your particular part in this play. If we do that well, then we've solved this line of sight problem. So now people understand, I see the change. I understand why the change is good for the organization. I hopefully understand why the change is good for me, and I understand my role to play. And we can also surface for those folks that maybe don't yet see that, what do we now need to invest in you so that you do feel confident to move forward with us as a team? And this necessitates more personalized learning journeys in our plan. Secondly, the antidote for employee engagement is we want to introduce as many co-creation opportunities and as many two-way feedback loops as we possibly can. Well, let me back up. I have a favorite saying, which is that the smartest person in the room is the room. And what that means is that, when we bring people together to talk about a problem, we're going to end up with a significantly better solution than if we just toss a solution over the wall from a smart consultant or a smart senior leader. We want to go out and get those ideas from people. We want to start taking ideas out to them and testing them, saying, what do you think? How do we make it better? What's resonating? What's not? As much as we can, whether that's through focus groups, whether that's through conversations, whether that's through workshops. And then as we're rolling things out, also just gathering that soft feedback, the what's the thumbs up and thumbs down, what's the sentiment, what are people feeling, what resonated, what didn't. If we can get those two-way feedback loops going, we can start to create a movement. And there's a tipping point factor that has been well studied that if we can get 20 to 30% of the organization on board with our movement, the rest of employees are 5 times more likely to actually join in. So co-creation results in people feeling like I've had a voice in this. This wasn't something tossed over the wall to me. This is something that I had my fingerprints on, and I'm on board. And that is contagious. So we want to do what we can to create a movement. And then third, this is again going to those folks that have budget. We need to invest in activation if we want to accelerate results. So we do not want to say, let's make this strategy, let's invest everything we need here, but then let's underinvest in the people part. We need to actually dedicate resources so that we're not moving right from plan to do, but rather we're thinking about the people in the organization. We're thinking about how we're going to move them up the activation curve. And we're investing the right things for each of those individual stakeholder groups to understand what communications, what learning and development, what type of culture activities do we need to do to shift them to do something different next Monday than the way they did it last Monday. So setting up the 4 phases, I want to just introduce one sort of core concept. I put this slide in here to try to answer the question for folks. Well, we use ProSci or we use Cotter's steps or we use McKinsey's approach. Doesn't matter. This approach is going to work no matter what your change approach is, because what we want to do is think about how people change, regardless of our change approach, whether it's ADKAR or anything else. You can actually, if you think about it closely, you can snap it right to this track. The activation curve describes how people learn. How do people start doing new things differently? So in the first phase, the hear it phase, what we're really solving for is that for me to do something differently, I first need to be aware of the change that we're talking about. I need to understand what it is and why we're doing it. And at some point, I have to get to a point of acceptance. So I've been convinced of the what's in it for me and what's in it for the organization, and that the solution is correct. This is largely communications, right? This requires a really good amount of tailored communicating to get to people's hearts and minds and get them on board. Then and only then are they ready for the learning phase. So if we start introducing learning and development sort of training work before this phase, it's going to fall dead. It's going to fall flat because I haven't yet crossed that acceptance line. Once I have accepted it, I will now be willing to acquire new skills, apply those new skills and ways of working. And hopefully by doing that, I'm going to start internalizing that, yes, this is better than the way we did it, or no, it's not better, but here's how we could do it differently. So now we're starting to both learn and have organizational conversations that are going to continue to accelerate us up that activation curve. And then finally, once they've internalized that, folks are going to start to integrate that into their ways of working. This is going to be starting to be new business as usual. New joiners in the company are going to start learning from peers that this is how we do it. And it'll get embedded in the organization over time. And at this point, we're even starting to think about building upon this yet again, looking into the future and maybe even improving it further. The key thing is, number one, we need to do this in this sequence. And number two, not every stakeholder group moves up this curve at the same pace. So our one size fit all solutions typically fail because one size fits none. We need to be thinking about what user groups maybe need more communications to be convinced, what user groups maybe need more learning and development to have the confidence that they've got the capabilities to do what we're asking them to do, what other organizations are maybe already up the curve that we don't need to invest as much in. But collectively, we need to be thinking about the cross section of the people in this mix. So our destination, before we start going into the how, is an activation plan. I want to pause here to say, if anyone that's sort of listened to our past podcasts, I talk quite often about how we need to shift as change managers to being marketers. And the idea being that we're really good as organizations of building tailored plans that are focused on target customers in our marketing world. But we need to do the exact same thing with employees in transformation. We need to start thinking about a campaign map that says, here are our numerous target audiences. And for each target audience, these are the campaign of events, activities, and communications that we want to deploy to get them to the place where they want to buy our product. So, what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks is how do we do that? How do we build a plan that is perfectly tailored to reach those stakeholders and get them on board to join our movement to move forward together? So, with that, I'm going to queue up one more poll. Want to just get a sense from folks in your experience, what is the most important factor in leading change efforts? You'll see these are all important things, right? So it's a hard choice deliberately. I just want to see, in your experience, which ones do you find to be most critical? Pick one. It's hard to pick your favorite child, I know, but go for it. And then we'll have a conversation around that. Wow, I wish I had time to read the chat because there's a lot of great stuff in there. I'll come back to it later. All right, how's it looking, Julie?
Almost there, just giving a few seconds.
Okay, get a good quorum here. Who's gonna win? I don't know. Oh yeah, that's fair. This question is one to noodle over. So if we want to give people a minute, extra minute or two, let's do it. Oh, interesting. Okay. This is a smart audience. So, we've got a pretty interesting result. We've got about a third saying, if I have to pick one, and I forced you to, sorry, that was a bit of a trick question. A clear and compelling vision of change is the most important thing. So, absolutely an ingredient we must have. Number two, in the lead, actually, a deep understanding of the stakeholders and potential barriers to change. I think some people read my book. Number three, a campaign of communications capability building and culture interventions. That comes in the third position with 17%. And then last at 7%, an agile and empowered governance and measurement system. So thank you all. I think that this was hard. I tried to do this myself as well, and I had a hard time picking. Um, I I am delighted, though, to see, if we close this now, that folks recognize that it's all four, right? It's obviously all four. But I think the thing that we need to do as change leaders is educate the fact that it's not just execution. So if we start to get into the content around the four phases of strategy activation and how to build an activation plan, we want to start to recognize that we're oftentimes forced to jump from the plan to the execute phase, right? And I think a lot of people in this room, obviously from the poll, understand that this is our dilemma. We're oftentimes, forced to jump over that activation a bit and skip that step. And what that poll tells me is a lot of people understand that there's a lot more under the water than that. We really need to be thinking about how do we, like any journey we're planning, how do we plan a journey with insights and knowledge so that we can get there smoothly? How do we understand where are the barriers, where are the obstacles, where are the potential pathways, where are the ladders and the chutes, so that when we do start to take those steps and we take that journey, our journey isn't stopped by some obstacle that we could have avoided. But that is often what happens. Sometimes it's just that simple. We are told to go right to execute, and we haven't made these investments. So what we want to do is invest in all four areas, and they are cumulative. So much like the poll recognized, this is a cumulative effect. We're going to build this together. And if we do all four of these things right, we're going to be part of that 20%. So today and in the coming weeks, what we're going to unpack are sort of four phases to how we can do this well and some tools that are inside of how to do that. I'll hit on some of the highlights today. In the envision phase, the most important thing we can do is sometimes take a step back from the strategy that we've been asked to deploy and say, what are we solving for? What is the vision? I can't tell you how many times I've seen senior leaders hire us to say, hey, let's take the strategy, let's bring it to life. And they want to go right to the town hall meeting and read that 100-page PowerPoint deck from McKinsey or Bain or BCG. Uh, and the audience is sort of like, what are we solving for? What are we doing here? We haven't shared the vision. So we need to start by recognizing these are human beings that need to understand where are we going and why. So in the envision phase, we want to step back and start to build that narrative. We want to understand what is our vision, what is our current state, what is the better future state, and how are we going to get there? And then what are the measuring sticks? How will we know that we've been successful? How will we track our progress? How will I know on my journey whether I'm a quarter of the way, halfway, or all the way there yet? So we want to get really crystal clear about that first. In the second phase, discovery, this is where we want to really take that design thinking into our ways of working and go out and do the understanding to say, what are the potential barriers to change? What are the obstacles that we need to overcome? What are the potential opportunities that we could harness so that we can design a plan that is truly tailored to the unique wants and needs of the organization? So we're in this one going to look at three things. We're going to look at the stakeholders. So what are the groups that are going to be impacted by this and what are their attitudes? Some of them might be on board, some of them might be opposed, some of them are on the fence. What do we need to do with those groups to get them where we need them to go? In the organization, is this organization, back to that change lever, that agile organization, that entrenched organization, is the transformation we're proposing actually in conflict with our culture? We need to look at those kinds of things in the organization to understand what we're up against. And then lastly, we want to look at the environment and understand, are there also things from the outside that it could be forces for our cause that we could take advantage of, or forces against that we should mitigate? With that content, we can now move into the design phase and actually design that tailored change program. We now know enough to say, I know what's different about this transformation and the organization's perspectives on it to know what interventions I need to introduce for us to be successful. So we're going to build an activation plan combining a series of different building blocks, typically made up of communications, of capability building, of culture activation, put them in the right order for the right audiences so that we now have an excellent plan to go execute. Then finally, in the execution phase, having not jumped right to it, we know we have a better plan that's anticipated the risks, that's mitigated some of the issues, that's taken into account the individual attitudes and different stakeholder groups. And yet we still have to keep in our mind that even in this execute phase, like all good execution phases, we need to have a governance system, we need to have a measurement system so we know where we're at. But we also have to have an iterative design mindset around refinement because even when we design that route from point A to point B, it's never a straight line at the end of the day. It's always going to be a jagged line because we need to course correct every time we learn something new. What's working well? What's not working? How do we get there? So just to give you a sense of the phases themselves and a kind of high level of what we're doing inside, in the envision phase, as I say, the most important thing here is to ensure that we have a clear and authentic vision that's going to speak to the hearts and minds of the people that are in the organization and get them inspired to sort of join our journey. A couple tools from my book that we use that, by the way, I'm going to share out with folks that attended. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on them today, but we will unpack each of these in the subsequent workshops. In this phase, the two most important things are clarifying the vision and making sure we know the measures. I like to use worksheets like this with teams because they're a forcing function. So for example, I'll illustrate just this one. In the vision map, what we oftentimes are going to do is we're going to sit down with senior leaders and we're going to say, I've got the deck, I've got the 100-page PowerPoint, but let's just talk very quickly at elevator pitch level. Talk to me about the 4 or 5 most important descriptors of the current state. And we put them into the left. Great. Okay. What's wrong with the current state? Why is this a problem? What are the challenges? Okay, great. Now let's talk about the future state. What's the future vision? And we want to define that vision in terms of what's it going to look like in the future. If you close your eyes in 5 years, 10 years, and open them up, what are we going to see? What's different and why is it better? So that starts to set up the bookends of a story, a transformation story. And then in the middle, we want to identify, okay, what are the 3, 4, 5 steps we need to take to get there? And these are going to be the major strategic themes that are describing how we're going to get from our current state to our future state. If we can't fit that all on one page, we aren't going to be successful because we need every senior leader to be able to tell at least this level of narrative consistently for us to be successful. And we want to be able to craft that clear vision story so that we can set it in people's minds so they're ready to receive more information. So I'll just simply say, contrast this with the town hall meeting where you walk in with the 100-page PowerPoint deck. We're not ready to receive that yet. We need to first set this story for folks to be able to get up that activation curve and be ready to say, now tell me more. So that's the most important thing about the vision phase, frankly, is getting that clarity and that simplicity to create that authentic story so that people can understand and be ready to learn. For those that are asking if these are available templates, they are publicly available, and I will be, for everyone that attended, I'll be sending them out to you. So we'll share them with you. We can spend a little bit more time with them. In the second phase, discovery, this is the phase I think that's probably the most underinvested, right? So this is really about going out in the organization and developing a deep understanding to inform our activation plan. We want to map that terrain ahead. We want to identify those barriers to change for both the stakeholders themselves and the organization. And we want to use that information to inform our activation plan. So in this phase, there's sort of three worksheets here on the right I'll share with you as sort of my go-to tools for this, but they collectively do this thing. They look at the world through three lenses, and they're the three lenses I think are most important for change activation planning. The first lens is stakeholders. So who in our organization are the most critical to realizing this change, and what are their attitudes, wants, and needs? So what we want to do here is we want to go out and say, for this transformation, what are the key stakeholder groups that need to get on board? If we're doing a customer centricity transformation, for example, it might be mostly customer facing folks. It might be customer service. It might be account executives. It's maybe not as much engineering as another or finance, but even those groups will probably have a stake in this. And each, every group touches customers in some way. How do we prioritize which stakeholder groups are the most critical, the most important to work with? And then how do we get inside their heads using empathy mapping, using conversations, using discussions to understand what is it that we want you to do and what are the key questions you've got to get you there? What do we need to overcome? So for one group, it might be, I'm on board, but I don't have the capabilities and skills. Well, great. For that group, that tells us we need to invest more in learning and development for that audience to get them over the hurdle. For another one, it might be, I don't understand why this is a problem in the first place. So we might need to focus more communications there. Key point being, we need to start thinking about each stakeholder group and mapping what are their wants and needs so that we can bring that into our activation plan. The second lens is the organization. Back to that change lever idea. Is this an organization that is more entrenched, more agile? Is this an organization who has a culture that's resistant to change? Is this transformation specifically threatening to the organization's values or culture in some way? We want to understand that because that'll allow us to understand where we might hit barriers and how we should overcome those. And then lastly, and the force field analysis template is a powerful one for this, it's the idea of the outside world and the context. Are there things in the outside world that we need to bring into account as well? So we live in a time of great change right now. Certainly, there's lots of us that are thinking about our regulatory things going to change our business? Our competitive situation is going to change our business? Is the geopolitical world going to change our business? Are there also things, rather than being forces against, that might be forces for? Are any of these changes potentially going to accelerate our transformation? We want to map those out purely for the reason of being ready for them, right? So for those forces against, we can build a risk mitigation plan and say, if this happens, here's how we're going to intervene. If those forces for show up for us, well, maybe we want to go faster and we want to know where we want to go faster. So by mapping all three of these components, we've got an opportunity to get a good sense of what are the prescriptions we need to prescribe for the symptoms we've discovered. Then we go into the design phase, then and only then. Because now, rather than just saying, go build a change plan to activate the strategy, we can intelligently build a change plan that's people-centered and understands the context that we're about to embark into. We've now charted that course ahead, and we're going to start to, with these activation plans, prepare for those known and unknown needs in a methodical way. So in this phase, we're basically focused on building that marketing campaign. We want to understand who are the stakeholders. So for each transformation, it might be a different set of key stakeholder groups. We're going to communicate to everyone, but we want to do tailored communications to those most critical stakeholder groups. So we want to identify those. We also want to look at the milestones. So if we look over time, maybe we've got driving deadlines. Our transformation's got to get here by this time, and this is why. We want to map that out and understand, if we have for example, there's going to be a new brand launch or a merger at this date. Well, great. Then we need to back plan from that date to say, when do we need to get these stakeholders ready for that event? So that milestones bit is really important for us to start to build the frame. With the frame of the stakeholder groups and the milestones, we can then think about, all right, what are the right building blocks? What are the right interventions that we're going to introduce? And building blocks, I think of as interventions. I think of them as the sum total of the various things that we're going to sequence for each stakeholder group to help that group in the right order generate the awareness, the understanding, the acceptance, and then ultimately start trying and developing new skills and capabilities and new ways of work to the point where they start to integrate it into their daily ways of being. That is a sequence. It isn't going to be a scattershot. They're not going to get it by getting an email and having to go to a PowerPoint deck and a SharePoint. It's got to be communicated in the way that people learn along that activation curve. Some examples of building blocks, and this is something we're going to talk a lot about in our session on design. We know that 10 times 10 ways is what they say in the military. I've heard 7 times 7 ways. I think we all agree you've got to communicate things multiple times in multiple different ways for it to stick. And that's because people learn in different ways. Some people are visual learners. Some people like to see a map. Others are auditory learners. Maybe they prefer a podcast. Other people like to read. Maybe they want to read a white paper or a one pager. We need to understand that we've got to build these plans out of multiple modes. Maybe it's the same information through a PowerPoint deck and a podcast and a 3-minute video and a one-page summary for us to get the message across. So we want to go beyond email and SharePoint, and we want to start thinking about a campaign of different types of interventions so that we can ensure we're canvassing the wants and needs of each of our unique stakeholders. So we can talk a lot about some of the things that are contained here, but I will share this sheet out with people. It's just a thought starter of some of the maybe new and different approaches you might be able to take as you're launching your own change campaigns. And then finally, we get to the execute phase. In the execute phase, now with that plan, we have a very important role to kind of continue this user-centered design loop, which is we need to make sure we do 2 things very well. We need to have a governance team. In some organizations, we might be leading a change and transformation for 30 or 40 or 50,000 people with just an office of 4 or 5. In others, it might be more comprehensive than that. But whatever we do, we need to make sure that before we launch this plan, that we've clearly identified who is accountable for managing this plan through, not just launching it, but managing it, right? Because like a ship's captain basically charted that straight line to the island and the sailboat, we know that that ship is going to do this going there. We need to have a governance team that basically is the ship's captain or the ship's crew, the people that are looking at the plan, they're seeing what happens, and they're making course corrections. So we should assume that even with the best plan we've ever made, as they say in the military, no plan survives first contact. As soon as it hits the organization, we're going to find that we were 80% right and we were 20% wrong, hopefully. Maybe not even that good. And for that remainder that we didn't see, the parts we didn't anticipate, the stuff that we didn't know, we need to make course corrections. We might learn that one group is moving right up the curve as we expected them to, but we didn't uncover a different issue for another group, and we might need to introduce something new. If we're doing this properly and we've got the right governance team who is empowered to make these decisions, empowered to make course corrections, and we have a measurement system in place that clearly is giving us real-time feedback, not pulse survey every 90 days, but rather real-time feedback. So we know when we launched this, this was people's sentiment, this hit, this didn't hit. We can then make the kind of course corrections to say, oh, great, that group's getting there faster. Maybe we don't need to invest as much there, but we need to pivot some of those resources over to this group because that customer service team, they're really fearful of this change and we need to really reassure them. So we need to invest in more communications here. That type of iterative design is the key to doing execution of change activation well. We need to make sure that we have mechanisms, measurement systems to sense what's going on. And then we've got a governance system to respond and make the course corrections that'll sort of keep us on track. So bringing all this together, I know this has been a long, mostly lecture, so my apologies. And I again promise in subsequent sessions we're going to have more interaction, but I really wanted to lay out the foundations here today. Bringing it together, we need to jump away from strategy to execution and towards user-centered design. We need to embrace the understanding that people are at the center of the organization, that people are not a monolith, but they're multiple different groups with multiple different wants and needs. And we need to really invest in ensuring that we've set a clear vision for where we're going and why. We've discovered what's unique in the organization that we need to address. We have a clear understanding of the different stakeholders and their varying wants and needs, and that we've designed a change campaign that actually addresses those needs so that we can bring everyone up the activation curve at the same pace. And then in the execute phase, we stay involved. We can't just fire and forget. We have to stay constantly evolved. We have to ensure that we've got the real-time feedback built into our programs so that we can constantly refine our program so that we can put ourselves in that 20% that are successful rather than those 80% that fail. So to some of the questions in the chat, I've teased out a couple of worksheets. These are all tools that I've used pretty consistently in my past work. They're designed to be fairly simple. They're in PDF format, but each of them is in effect an exercise to get at some of these core things. So we've got a vision map to actually work with senior leaders to sit them down and force them into creating an elevator pitch around the vision story. That vision story can then be turned into a narrative. It can be turned into a vision map. It can be turned into a lot of things. But the key thing is if there's a group of 8 leaders in the room, we don't want them telling 8 different stories. We want them consistently telling one story, and that's so important. So we'll share an approach to doing that. There's a couple templates around how to build a measurement system, how to start to do stakeholder understanding, thinking about the organizational impacts, thinking about the contextual impacts, as well as some examples of some templates that you might be able to use for your own activation planning. In the subsequent workshops, I'm hoping to also in these webinars share not only how to use them, but maybe bring some other tools and templates to the fold. So my goal at the end of this is to really equip and empower each of you with some tools that you can choose to use in your daily work that might help accelerate some of this work while starting to embed some of these ways of working in your process. Um, Julie will drop a link in for the next webinar. If you haven't already signed up, would love to invite you to join us for our Envision webinar coming up. This is where we're going to really unpack that Envision phase and talk about how we work with senior leaders to get them aligned around a common vision, how we turn that into a narrative that can really help people understand where we're going and why, and then how we can build the measurement systems in place to build momentum as we're moving along. We want to not only launch that vision, but we want to make sure that we're tracking where we're at in that story and then get people excited about the fact that we're progressing towards it. And then beyond that, we've got a series of others that I'd love to have you join us for. Please feel free to join us and reach out if you've got questions about that. On the workshop templates, I will be emailing those out to folks. And if you've got questions about them, I'm happy to chat about those questions one-on-one. So please do feel free to reach out to me. And then with that, I think I have successfully saved us a few minutes for some questions. So maybe let's take five or six questions before we wrap up that we can address and see if there's anything that we might be able to answer today while we're still on the call. Julie, did we have any key themes in the questions that we should look at?
Yes, so there was how can you distinguish between activation and adoption? And then the questions were all pretty varied, so I put them in the chat. So if you want to address one or two of them, and then maybe one or two that have just been posted, maybe we can do it that way. Up
Sure.
to you.
No, that's great. Thank you. So, how we distinguish between activation and adoption, I think there's probably a bunch of answers to that, but for me, activation is the act of generating adoption. So, um, we see adoption when we've seen people cross from the believe it phase into that live it phase. That's when we know that we've seen adoption because we've seen them actually applying their new ways of working, integrated into their ways of working, And ultimately, they're starting to tell their peers, hey, this is how we do things around here. So what we want to look for are sort of adoption signals. How do we know people have adopted it? Well, what are the signals in your particular transformation that are showing us that people have changed their ways of work? Is it use of a new tool? What is the rate of adoption of a particular new technology system we've deployed? Are we seeing people's behavior change and a culture shift happening at the right rate? Activation is all the work leading up to that. So a lot of what we're trying to do in activation is fundamentally to change the way people do things next week versus the way they used to do it. And so a lot of this discussion is how do we accelerate that, right? I don't think there's probably anything here that's completely new to people, but as a system, what we want to do is say, how do we get that adoption faster? So that's our goal. Can you elaborate on some of the key principles of what modern change activation looks like? I get the process, but would love more insights in what the key principles might be. Um, I think the if I'm understanding this correctly, the key principle for me around modern change adoption is shifting to a people-centered approach versus a monolithic organizational approach. And so it's a mindset shift more than anything else. If you think back to that slide that showed the hierarchical structure versus the organism structure, our organizations now are living organizations. They're living, you can almost think of them as living beings. They are oftentimes more modular. They're teams working towards goals. Those teams collectively are adding up towards larger goals. But importantly, people in organizations now have significantly more agency than they used to in 1950. And so the most important principle for me, I think, is having us all recognize that we cannot treat the organization like a monolith. We can't use a one size fits all change program. And if we do, we'll fail because we're using an outdated technology to address organisms of people who have agency. So that would be my number one principle is shifting that mindset. And it probably seems obvious to most of us because most of us are in the change business based on the first poll. But it's still not what most people that graduated from business school 30 or 40 years ago think, right? And that's the audience 20 or 30 years ago that is now leading most of the Fortune 500. So we really need to all ourselves be advocates for change. We need to all sort of be out on the pulpit, telling the story about people-centered change, because we need to start to change the conversation. We need to make sure that people with old ideas and ways of working are changing themselves. I might close this comment with one of my favorite phrases, which is that change management is about changing management. So we need to be talking to the people in charge and making sure that they understand deeply in their heart that change is actually about changing the way we work and focusing on people in the organization, and then investing in the resources that we need to make to bring people along on the journey that we're traveling with. So with that, I recognize we're at time. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining today. Please, here's my contact information. If anyone ever wants to reach out, office hours are always open. I'd be happy to chat with anyone about their change topics or if you have questions about this material. And I will follow up and share some of these templates out with folks. I hope to see you next week. And until then, I'm just very grateful to each of you for creating positive change in the world. Thank you all.